This is the Motherlands podcast. The intention of this podcast is to provide evidence-based information through honest conversations on fertility, pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and beyond by bridging together the two worlds of allopathic medicine and holistic practices to improve the reproductive health outcomes of women. I am your host, Keely Semler. There are certain conversations that will forever stick out in my mind as being both pivotal and enlightening to me personally and professionally. This next conversation is definitely one of them. Tema Mercado is a midwife and a partera who resides in San Diego, California. I asked Tema if we could talk about community-based midwifery care and how it supports Indigenous communities. What I love most about Tema and what she shares is how she isn't just talking the talk, but she is an active participant in practicing everything it is that she teaches. We talk about what does community mean and how her family is connected to her work as a midwife, and she doesn't have to worry about her children because she knows they are in the loving hands of her husband at home. And there's no animosity about her having to be at a birth for 3 or 4 days. There is a mutual respect for each other and the work she is doing as a midwife. As someone that supports families through birth, I have seen firsthand how midwives are often really separated from their families. And there's this unfortunate joke that I mentioned in the episode about midwives' children become orphaned when they go to work. And it's really sad, but it's often something I see time and time again. So there's something refreshing to me hearing Tema talk about how her work is so interwoven into her family life and how her clients are all coming from her community and how her husband knows who she's with and the family she's supporting. There's a level of humility that Tema possesses that instantly puts me at ease and allows me to reflect for myself what actually matters when it comes to supporting families in labor and birth. If you happen to know someone that works with a brand or a company that shares a similar ethos of providing deeper and comprehensive care to women and mothers, and who may be open to supporting the Motherlands podcast, I'd love to chat with them. You can email me, hello@keelysemler.com. I think you're going to really enjoy this one. Please remember to like and leave a review only if you enjoy it. And thank you again for being here. I'll see you again soon. For anyone that's listening that might not be familiar with who you are and your practice, I'm wondering if you can share, where you practice and what you do.
Mm-hmm. I practice in San Diego County, also Kumeyaay, unceded territories, and I am a midwife. I provide community birth options, so birthing outside of the hospital, home birth mostly. I've supported a lot at birth centers as well. I have a small midwifery practice myself. I have a colleague, Alex Medina, who is a newer midwife who I had the pleasure of supporting through her training and appreciated her support. So I asked her to stay on and become the second midwife in my practice. And then I always have at least one other midwife in training who supports the practice and who we support through their education as well. That's in a nutshell.
And are you also practicing midwifery care in Mexico?
Not right now, but I did for several years. Once the pandemic hit, I also became pregnant with my last child. So at that point, I made a conscious decision to slowly begin removing myself from attending births in Mexico. And so like the first year, I limited my care only to repeat clients that were delivering in Mexico. And then by the second year, so once my baby was born, it was going to be more involved to cross the border with a newborn or a 1-year-old. I attended most of my births when my son was 1 year old. I brought him with me. Crossing the border with my, infant into Mexico and back would have been a little bit more challenging. There's just not enough backup midwives in Tijuana, so it's just made it a little bit more difficult. And then also, As I began to remove myself, my colleague Jimena Rojas, who I worked with in Tijuana, she started having more support. So she started training other parteras and midwives in Tijuana who were supporting her. So I felt like the need for me to be over there wasn't so great anymore. At one point, it was just Jimena and myself providing care. But after several years of supporting her and families in Mexico, we had more trained birth assistants who could help her. And then, also Jimena started training parteras from different parts of the Mexican Republic. So I felt like I could graciously begin to remove myself. But I do still consider some births in Mexico for repeat clients or return clients. It's just become increasingly difficult because in the state of Baja California, at this point, getting a birth certificate for home birth families is incredibly involved, and it's a very arduous process. And many families decide not to have a home birth because what is involved in order to get a birth certificate is sometimes just not desirable.
They make it so hard, right?
Yes.
Do you think that's deliberate because the government would prefer families to give birth in the medical system, do you think? Or
Yes and no. There's a lot of moving parts. And so I think it would be very misleading to say this is the one reason why it is.
Mhm.
One is that there's a huge lack of education about home birth or modern home birth practices because in Mexico, home birth is more common there than it is here in the US, but it is more common in indigenous communities. And so in Mexico, the only protections that exist are for indigenous midwives who are registered, who live and work within their communities. It's not perfect either. They too have challenges, but it's easier for them to obtain a birth certificate. There's nothing, even in the most recent bills, as recent as June, that state that professional midwives can issue birth certificates. In some states, yes, but not in all states. And so what happens is that there's a process to obtain the birth certificate worksheet. And while Vital Records says, yes, you can register if you are a midwife, they're not the ones who give out the birth worksheet. That has to be given through the Department of Health. And in order to register with the Department of Health, you have to have, it's kind of like an NPI number, but you could only have an NPI number if you have graduated and are licensed by certain technical or universities, which those routes don't exist for midwives. So our education is outside of that model. And because we can't obtain that NPI number, we can't register to receive these documents. So, like I said, it's very complex. We are not recognized by all the systems. So there's no systems in place for us to obtain that information.
This is super interesting to me. I'm wondering, being that you have practiced in Mexico as a partera and practicing in the US, what are some other differences in terms of practicing in the US versus Mexico?
We have more privilege as American midwives. We have secure and readily available access to the hospital. If we call an ambulance, the ambulance will come, and they will come in a timely manner, and they will be equipped, and they'll have supplies for you. If you don't have money or insurance, you can still receive care, and they won't even ask you for money or insurance. They're not going to say, go somewhere else. You don't have money to pay right now. They're not going to say, we can't give you a blood transfusion unless your family members come and donate blood. They're not going to ask your partner to go buy the antibiotics that you need for your infection. So there's a lot more privilege crossing the border into the US. The higher level care for emergency obstetrical complications are, in that sense, more secure versus in Mexico, your options are either a private hospital, which most private hospitals have a C-section rate of 90% or more, and you have to pay, or you can go to the public hospital, which has a higher rate of vaginal births. I think it's like 50 to 60%, and higher rates of exclusive breastfeeding as well. But they are also going to have a higher rate of obstetrical violence. So it's different in that way.
Do you think that the private hospitals in Mexico, the reason why cesarean rate is higher is because it's more profitable?
Yes and no. There's a lot of private practice in Mexico. So they're not group practices. These are private
Individuals.
practices. Yes, individual practices.
Hmm.
And at the private hospitals, they don't have attending doctors that are just there all the time, specifically for obstetrics and gynecology. So it's not like you can go to a private hospital and there's going to be an anesthesiologist and somebody who will give you a cesarean if needed. They're calling in an anesthesiologist, they're calling in an OB. So if you're a private doctor, it's easier for you to schedule an induction or schedule a cesarean because if your client just goes into labor all of a sudden and you're unavailable or you live across town, then that can make it more difficult.
Right.
Hmm.
Well, we see that in the US too, but maybe not to the same degree. With
Right. Well, because in the US, if your client goes into labor, they can go to a myriad of hospitals, at least two or three different options in a regular city. And there's going to be triage nurses, there's going to be somebody who could do a cesarean. Most hospitals have standby anesthesiologist. Here in the US, you don't even have to go to the hospital that your doctor or your insurance approves. You can choose to go to your preferred hospital instead, and all of that stuff will still be there, and they will still have to take care of you.
Right. Since we're on the topic of community-based midwifery care, and I'm thinking through the lens of all of these indigenous practices that so many midwives and birth workers, myself included, use to enhance their practice. One that comes to mind for me is the Rebozo.
Mhm,
And first, I'm wondering for listeners if you can explain what the Rebozo is and what it's used for.
mhm,
And secondly, what are ways that non-Indigenous birth workers can honor these practices, even if
mhm,
they don't come from this cultural background? I'm really sensitive to this because I am a Caucasian birth worker and I
mhm.
am sensitive to some amazing technology that comes from different Indigenous cultures, and I want to be mindful of that. So, can you speak to that?
Yeah, this is another question that I get asked a lot. And so I'll first say, that I'm not like an authority on this topic and I'm very human and I have my own relationship to rebozos and the manteada work. I will share about it. And then for listeners, what I share can inform your perspective, but at the end of the day, like you have to use your own sense of responsibility to really measure what you decide to do or not do. What you heard on a podcast should not be what informs your sense of ethics. So that's the first thing that I will say. What I want to say about the rebozo is that it wasn't made for birth, but in the American world, the view has been so narrow that they only see it as that. And I believe that that is the biggest problem because that's what happens when we look at cultures or traditional practices that are foreign to us. We view it with one lens and we unknowingly take its value away. It's like judging a book by its cover. You're just seeing the cover and you're just using it for the cover as a prop or something, or for just this one thing, when really it has such a rich history. The value of its heritage is quite, quite rich. And so I think what happens is that that has been lost in translation.
Hmm.
And so the reason why the rebozo became so popular is because it is beautiful. It is so beautiful. It's captivating. And that's because traditionally, women were the ones who were to weave the rebozo. They would weave rebozos on a backstrap loom on their knees, on the ground, attached to a tree. And they would do this for months, string by string. And even the string, like people would work with the cotton, they would dye the cotton. There's this whole like tradition that dates back to so long, It dates back to some of the origin stories or creation stories,
Mm.
So that's how special the rebozo is it goes back to, as we believe, the beginning of our time as people on this earth. And so when we talk about the rebozo as a birth tool, you can see how degrading that is. So the use of the rebozo was popularized because most Mexican women have a rebozo. We use it to cover ourselves.
Readily available. It's
Yes.
everywhere.
Yes. I mean, I don't really use a rebozo too much during the summertime, but if I'm going out on a date with my husband, I'm going to use my rebozo instead of a jacket. Like our rebozo covers us from the elements. Our rebozo adorns us. It's a part of how we adorn ourselves. In olden times, it was a way of demonstrating what village you come from. You can demonstrate, like, I'm a married woman. You can demonstrate I'm a person of status, actually, or I am, a single person, or I come from this family. So the colors, the patterns, they all have a significance. So it's actually really, really beautiful. I mean, there's anthropologists who that's all they do is study the rebozo, right?
That's incredible.
So, because if you're a Mexican midwife or a Mexican woman, you probably have a rebozo, with you when you go to a birth, and it's accessible. You could use it for a lot of things, carrying a baby, carrying groceries, holding your skirt up, those kinds of things. So then it was used at births, to help soften the body or to help with pain relief. And so that is something that we call to mantear or mantear, which is kind of like sifting, but a little bit different. And the word itself, manteada, comes from the word manta, which means muslin, because muslin was one of those things that we used a lot. Those are traditional cloths that we used. And so we had mantas for everything, for cleaning, for making our clothes, for sheets. And so before the rebozo, the manteada was done with a manta. The rebozo wasn't the first thing that was used for manteada. And to be quite honest, if, right now rebozos are being mass produced, so it's easy to get blood or amniotic fluid on it. But, before you had maybe one, maybe two rebozos, depending on how much money you had. And you take care of those. You don't get blood or amniotic fluid on you. You would take care of it. So you would be using something else. Like, that's how privileged we are that we can buy a rebozo for each new family. It's kind of like, wow, things have kind of really, really changed instead of,
Being a little more resourceful, maybe.
yeah.
I've definitely been at births before where I didn't have my Rebozo with me. I usually have one in my car. But hey, a throw on someone's couch, that can work. It's not as sacred a technology, maybe, but it can be helpful if you need it. And some people are curious about Rebozo, but maybe they don't have time or money to invest in one, and I'm like, well, a nice throw blanket can work too.
Yeah, and I think, that's also another thing because I like heard some people say like, oh, you better buy an authentic rebozo, which I do believe that, just in my way of thinking, whenever I buy things, I usually, buy from like locally sourced, handmade. If possible, I'm choosing, woman-owned businesses, right? Like I think very carefully of where I'm putting my money as much as possible. So there's good reasoning for all of that. But when you're attending a birth, you're attending life as it is. And if you're going to be at a birth to be a helper, you're going to do what you need to do to help, right? And so first things first, as birth attendants, that's why we're there. So you're going to be resourceful and tend to that baby and to that birth, as best as you can. I'm also not somebody who's like, oh, I'm going to rebozo everybody. I don't do that. If I don't have to do anything, that's actually ideal because then that means that a baby's coming and
The mom feels totally in her body and focused, and she's in harmony.
yeah, I mean, I would say that if I'm using a rebozo or if I'm doing any type of manteada, it's because something's happening and something needs help, but I'm not just doing it to do it.
Mhm.
if that makes sense. And I think that, as newer birth attendants, whether we want to call ourselves doulas or midwives, due to our lack of like experience or confidence, we sometimes are just overdoing it.
Yeah.
You know, and this is really telling like with your birth bags, because sometimes in your birth bags, you start off with like a whole bunch of stuff in your doula bag. And then by like year 3 of doulaing, you maybe have like one essential oil and a little tiny bag with just a couple of things in there. Because you start to understand that the biggest tool you have in birth attending is yourself,
Is
is
your
your
presence, right? Yeah.
Yes, is your presence. So,
I love that. It really, really hits home for me. How do you navigate the intersection of clinical research and the medical board and
mhm,
having to follow certain guidelines,
mhm.
as well as, Indigenous medicine and helping people feel more rooted to their bodies and the earth and maybe perhaps a more holistic perspective? How do you navigate that with your clients? And what happens when they conflict with one another, as I'm
Mhm.
guessing maybe they do sometimes?
Well, this is, I think, an important question because right now there is a lot of conversation or a lot of talk about what it is to be a real midwife, and what it is to be a good midwife and what it is to, be a birth attendant, right? There's a myriad of like perspectives and ways of practicing or of approaching it. And for myself, as a woman who was the first in her entire family line to be born on this side of the border, the truth is that there are certain realities that myself and my community, my family and friends, that we have to navigate differently. The way that I get treated at hospitals is very different than my white colleagues.
Hmm.
They still don't get treated that great, unfortunately. And the way that my non-white clients get treated in the medical complex is also very different.
Hmm.
So that's something that I cannot ignore. We're also more likely to have CPS called on us. My clients are more likely to have toxicology screens done on them. There's different types of precautions that have to be taken because of that. We're more likely to be removed from our children as well, because statistically speaking, brown women are more likely to have preeclampsia, have babies who have higher blood sugars or all of these different things. So we get more interventions tossed at us. So for me, having a license is important for a few reasons. And one of them is that actually extends a protection to the community that I serve.
Hmm.
So that if a social worker wants to say that they're being negligent, I could say no. They are receiving care by a licensed professional and nothing that they're doing is illegal. Or if the baby isn't gaining weight, I could say, we have a plan. I am documenting weights. I'm doing all of these things. In a sense, I create kind of like a legal protection for them in that sense. Also, it protects me. My license protects me from going to prison.
Mm-hmm.
My license protects me from practicing medicine without a license. And so for me, caring for a new family, for that new mother, that birth giver, that new baby, they're just as sacred as my family is. My family is sacred too. My ability to continue serving new families is also sacred. And the truth is that what I do, so as the person that I am, the way that I present, the way that I look, there might be medical professionals or social workers who might question my professionalism just because of my name and the way that I look. Those are things that I have no shame in protecting.
Hmm.
That's on one hand, there's that. And then when it does come to like actually dealing with what's going on in the pregnancy or at birth or at postpartum, depending on the family, right? Because there's families who have different degrees of what they want. And I'm not going to assume
Mm.
that they want everything to be traditional. I'm not going to assume that they have spiritual resilience to support them through the great mystery that is birth. If they are hiring me because they need me to take on some of that responsibility, I know how to do that. And there's boundaries, of course, and I have limitations, of course, because I too know what my family needs and what my spiritual resilience looks like to deal with the ramifications of dealing with something in a more traditional way, right? It's very complex. So for me, the most important part is prenatally when I work with somebody, there's a lot of getting to know one another. And I often say that I don't believe in client-centered care. I believe that that in itself is problematic because it dehumanizes the midwife.
And the relationship, the connection.
Right. Right, because what it does is that it puts the burden on the midwife to make everything right.
Mm.
And the midwife is not God, and she's also not a magician. If I am working with somebody who is expecting me to ensure that the delivery is safe, but they want to put all of that responsibility on me, then I might be a lot more conservative.
Ooh, tell me about that. Can you tell me a little bit more? Oh, I'm so fascinated by this because even though I'm not a midwife, I am a doula, and I think sometimes people hire me thinking, oh, I hire the doula, I'll have the birth I want. And it doesn't work that way. So tell me what in your mind or in your body tells you that you might need to be more conservative if you feel like a client is really putting it on you.
I asked them about their fears. What's your greatest fears? And then I'm very thorough with my education. So I will spend an hour talking to you about how do you feel about the fact that you're GBS positive? How do you feel about antibiotics or about not getting on antibiotics? What if your bag of water breaks before your labor starts? So like talking about all of those things, like doing a lot of deep inquiry and then saying, this is what the recommendation is per the medical model, but you hired a midwife. Per the midwifery model, this is what
Mm.
the guidelines are. And guidelines are just guidelines. There isn't actually like rules that say you have to do this. So these are the guidelines. This is my experience, right? Because I might not have experience. So I'm transparent, like, how much experience do I have with this? Because I could say, sure, I'll do this. I'll catch a breech baby. But what if I've never caught a breech baby before? Right? So I'm transparent about my experience. And then I am transparent about my comfort and if there's any boundaries. And then I put it back into their court. How do you feel about that? How is that landing, And then I always tell them, like, their consent, it can be removed at any time. So I always tell them, you might feel about this a certain way right now. And, come tomorrow, you might feel differently about it. And if that happens, you have permission for that to happen. And we need to communicate about it. So there's a lot of checking in, and I don't assume that somebody wants something to be a certain way.
Mm.
And when they change their mind and they have a different opinion about things and they want things to be different, then I believe them. I believe what their wishes are, regardless of what I think or my experience is.
What happens when you're caring for a client and maybe they're making a choice that you don't agree with? How do you
Mhm.
navigate that and support yourself through that?
That doesn't happen too often. And I believe that that's because,
The relationship you build,
yes,
probably.
yes, the relationship that has been built, and also because I am very thorough. I offer a lot of information, a lot of education, and I tell people we're making this decision together.
Mm.
You're as much responsible for this as I am. And there's going to be repercussions or blessings that come out of this. And is that what you want? if it were ever to be like something that I was 100% not okay with, or if I was really, truly fearing that there was going to be a bad outcome, I would share that too with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I would share if I was comfortable or not comfortable. But I've never had to do that. I've never had to say that.
And I think that's such a testament to your model of care and how you build these connections and relationships with your clients. There's less room for that, right?
Yes, I don't want to say it's a perfect model. It's still a work in progress, and I think it will always be a work in progress. You could get incredibly lucky and never have, any issues. But I find, when I talk to my colleagues who have been practicing for 20, 30, 40 years, we're working with individuals, and the way you practiced for 10 years with all the individuals that were so happy with your care could not be a favorable experience to another family.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you don't see it coming.
Mm.
Sometimes you're like, what happened? We had such a good relationship. And because the birth wasn't perfect, now the relationship is ruined, right? And I also think, that there's a lot of room for midwives to also own things that maybe calls that weren't done right or things that could have been different in retrospect. But yeah, that's why it's really important, when people talk about informed consent, that really requires so much education and
Mm-hmm.
so much trust, And sometimes there isn't a whole lot of room for it, especially in an emergency.
Right. So, who supports you and how do you take care of yourself and come down from births? Do you have any practices or
Mhm.
ways to really nourish yourself after? I mean, all birth I think can be intense, but
Mhm.
just how do you get back in your own body and find your own, I
Mhm.
don't want to say balance because I don't know if I believe in balance, but just feel more in
Mhm.
your body again.
There's things that I do prior to birth and then after birth as well, because I think there's a careful preparation for the births, right? So I limit my clients to 2 to 3 births a month, and I take 4 months off every year. 2 months off in the summer, 2 months off.
Amazing.
Yeah, I'm not a machine. Nobody is. I try my best to reasonably price so that that is makes sense, right? So that I could actually make ends meet. Yeah, and when you have less clients, you're able to provide a different kind of care. And of course, midwives who have a lot of clients are going to disagree. But having gone from like busy practices to remolding my practice time and time again, absolutely 100%. If you're only preparing for 2 births that month, the amount of time you have with them individually to provide more education, to build a bigger relationship, you just have more time for it. It's like when they say, the math isn't mathing. Well, yeah, you have 8 clients due this month. And you thought you gave good informed consent or that you spend enough time, but you cut that visit short because you had to see, X amount of people that day. Did that client really receive the time they needed with you? Did you have enough time with them for you to receive the information you needed to show up for them in the way that they uniquely needed? So that's one of those things. That's part of my self-care is getting to know the client because that helps me feel more connected to them. And it allows me to enter the birth with less fear and less doubt. And so then I can show up as a more steady human for them. At the birth, I'll go outside and I'll say a prayer for the family, the baby, myself, my helpers, any of the helpers at the birth. After the baby is born, I say another prayer. And sometimes this is a private, just by myself. But if I'm working with community members, people who have my same like spiritual understanding of things, then we do it communally as a team. But I would say that the most important thing is that I have a partner who supports my birth work. So my husband, he is a husband through and through, and he's a father through and through. So I know that when I'm at a birth, my children are well and taken care of. I'm not worried about them. I'm not pressing to go back home. So I could be present at the birth because I know that my children will be fed. I know that my children are being well supported and loved. And I know that I'm not going to come home to an angry partner because I was at a 3-day birth. I know that my bath is going to be made. There's going to be food ready for me when I get home. And my husband will go as far as to taking the children out of the home just to make sure that I could get that sleep in. And
My goodness. What a gift. And it shouldn't be considered a gift, but what a beautiful partnership. Very special.
yeah, so that is probably the best thing that has helped me continue doing this. But, we have had to build that together. It wasn't like that at the beginning. At the beginning, I was attending too many births. I wasn't having those 4 months off. I wasn't pricing reasonably, like the energy exchange wasn't being matched. So my husband was not happy. My children were not happy. My marriage was not doing well. And there was a lot of conceding and there was a lot of reality checking.
Mm.
And so that's how I started to morph my practice in a way that would not take away from the people that I was serving, but that was not going to take away from my family life. And it's just made everybody a lot more happier. And I also feel like my clients have really appreciated seeing that modeled for them.
I was just going to say, you bring up such a really beautiful point, which is your ability to be humble and honest and thorough is both in your personal life and it then translates with your relationships with your clients. The practice isn't just with your birth clients, it's also in your personal life. And I think that that's something that's really beautiful and special and unique. There's a lot of midwives, the phrase that midwives' children are orphans because they're so busy working and they're not home. And some of my mentors in their 70s talk about like there's some amazing midwives, but their personal lives fall apart. And why is that? And it's not their fault per se, but it takes time and structure and organization and a willingness to be honest about what support is needed so that you can continue to do the work. Even for me as a doula, I'm like, I don't know. I want to be able to offer this forever and ever, but their body only has so much energy reserves, and my time is only so limited. And what is left for my partner? Because some days I feel like he only gets the scraps, and that's not fair.
Yeah, there's really a whole lot to say about this topic in particular. I know we're like probably towards the end of our time here, but I don't actually view my midwifery work or my call to midwifery as a career choice. Like, this is my way of life. It is who I am. It is what the Creator has gifted me with, this unique responsibility and blessing to be with birthing women and to be with new babies coming into the world. And so I'm always on call. I'm always praying about the babies. I'm always preparing for the time that I get called out. The way that I live my life is to enrich the way that I support other families and vice versa, right? Like, the time that I spend with families should also be equally enriching in some way to who I am as a person and to my family. Like, I want my family to feel good and happy when I come home from a birth. I want them to be happy to receive me. I want them to know, like, yes, I was gone for 3 days, and we can go on that family vacation in the summer, and we can, afford to do the things that we need to do in our lives, and to build those community relationships too, because I've gotten to attend births for my husband's colleagues. I've gotten to attend births for community members, people that we've grown up with, right? So all of that kind of strengthens our community bonds. It's really beautiful because I'll just kind of give you an example. So the most recent birth that I got to attend, it was a longer birth with a premature rupture of membranes, a first-time mom. I stayed with her for 3 nights and 4 days until the baby came. But this was a community member. This was the daughter of one of our fire chiefs in ceremony. And I knew that I could be at that birth because my husband and my children, they know this woman who was giving birth. And so they were praying for her and they were rooting for her. And they knew mommy was supporting this particular family.
Mm.
And as I was at the birth and, having these long nights and working hard and, being so tired, I just kept on thinking about over the past decade how the grandfather of this baby that was being born, how many times this man sat on his knees and prayed all night for my family's prayers. How many times he literally tended to the fire that was being kept lit so that my family prayers could be taken care of. And so for me, it was like, wow, I get to be at this ceremony of his grandchild,
Mm.
and I get to tend to this fire now. I get to tend to this fire, and it's not a burden.
Mm.
It is a blessing. Wow, I get to give back to this family
Mm.
who has supported my family. And so I had more resilience. I had less fear, I had less doubt, I had less judgment on how this birth was going because my relational ties, my connection to this family allowed me to say, yeah, I know it's a long birth. Yeah, I know that the bag of water has been broken for a long time. Yes, I know the risk factors. And we're all committed and we're all in. As long as all the checks and balances are there, we can continue. I will continue with you guys. That's what I mean about how like my outside life enriches my midwifery life and how my midwifery life is going to enrich my outside life. Because I know that this family, as they grow, they will remember this birth ceremony and they will remember that their auntie Tema stood by their side. And maybe one day in the future, my family or my children will need something. And when that prayer request gets put out, I know that that family will support in some way, somehow. Like that's not the expectation, but that's just how
Mm.
relationship is.
Well, and that's really the heart of community-based midwifery care, I think. How beautiful to share that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much for your time and just what a beautiful conversation that I think will be so lovely for listeners to hear. And I know that you are busy, and I'm sure your practice is doing quite well. But if anyone that's listening wants to interact with you, how
Mhm.
can people find you?
Well, I have a website, it has a lot of information. It's lamatrizbirth.com. And then I also share a lot of information on social media when I'm not busy. It's not like super curated, midwifery information, but it's just like the life of a midwife, in and out of birth setting. I guess that's the best way you can kind of get to know who I am. And when I'm not on call, I try to offer workshops here and there, mostly for birth professionals, for families who want to work with me, that's almost exclusively as a midwife. I focus my attention in San Diego County, but I will make some exceptions to LA and Riverside. It obviously requires more effort on my behalf. And so I also request a different kind of commitment for families that are in different counties. But yeah, my Instagram handle is Matriz Midwife.
Thank you so much, Tema, for your time and again, your humility and honesty and thoroughness with explaining how you approach your work and also your life is just so refreshing. So, thank you again.
Thank you. It's a work in progress. It's not perfect. Lots of trials and hardships, but I chose to learn from them. And I know that in 10 years, if you ask me these questions again, the answers might be very different.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you
maybe we
for
can meet again in
inviting
10 years.
me. All right. All right. Well, thank you. And you have a wonderful evening as well.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share with friends and family and stay tuned for the next episode.